The chair next to mine had been empty for 40 minutes. I knew because I'd been staring at it. Not because I wanted company. God, no. I specifically chose this seat. Table 14, tucked against the far wall of the Meridian Grand Ballroom, close enough to the emergency exit that I could feel the faint draft coming through the bottom of the door. Far enough from the dance floor that nobody would notice me sitting alone, nursing the same glass of white wine I'd poured when the reception started and hadn't actually drunk yet. I was fine. I kept telling myself that. I'm fine. I'm completely fine. Except Marcus was slow dancing with his new wife right now, 40 feet away from me, his hand resting on the small of her back in the exact way he used to touch mine. And the maid of honor had announced during the cocktail hour that the couple had started dating almost a year ago, which meant I took a long sip of wine, which meant what I'd suspected for a long time was true, and I was the last person in this entire ballroom to officially know it. I'd come anyway. I don't know why. Simone had invited me before the engagement, when we were still close, and I couldn't bring myself to RSVP no, because that would have meant explaining, and explaining would have meant saying out loud the things I still couldn't fully organize in my own head. So I'd bought a dress, dark green, simple, nothing that would make anyone look twice. And I'd booked a room at this hotel 2 floors up, and I'd told myself I was doing this for Simone, who was Marcus's cousin and my actual friend, and had nothing to do with any of it. I was doing fine. Right up until the seating chart put me at table 14 with 6 strangers who all turned out to know each other from college, and who'd spent the last 20 minutes in animated conversation about a ski trip they'd taken in 2019. Not one of them had looked in my direction. Not once. The ballroom was beautiful. I'll give it that. The Meridian did weddings the right way. Tall ceilings with chandeliers that dropped warm amber light across everything. White tablecloths with gold runners. Tall arrangements of white peonies and eucalyptus that smelled faintly sweet when the air moved. The kind of room that made you feel like romance was a natural state of being, something that existed all around you like oxygen, or made you feel it should anyway. I was considering a second glass of wine, or possibly just going upstairs, changing into the oversized t-shirt I'd packed and ordering room service, when I felt it. Not heard, not saw, felt. A shift in the room. The way a pressure change feels before a storm, subtle but unmistakable. The table to my left, which had been lively and slightly too loud all evening, went quiet first. Then the couple on my right stopped talking mid-sentence. I watched a waiter pause with a tray of champagne flutes balanced on his palm, and looked toward the entrance of the ballroom with an expression I couldn't immediately name. Caution, maybe, or something closer to instinct. I turned. There were 4 of them, but I only registered one. He was tall for a Korean man, or maybe it was just the way he held himself, shoulders back, no urgency in his step whatsoever. Like a person who had never once in his life felt the need to hurry because the world reliably waited. Dark suit, impeccably cut, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat, and I could see the edges of tattoos there. Dark ink tracing up the side of his neck, deliberate and extensive. His face was... I'm not going to pretend I didn't notice. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that were already moving across the room in slow, methodical assessment. Taking in corners and exits and distances the way most people take in centerpieces and seating arrangements. He wasn't looking for a good time. He was looking for something specific. The 3 men with him fanned out slightly as they entered, not dramatically, just a natural repositioning that created a pocket of space around him without anyone having to say a word. A couple near the entrance physically stepped aside. One of the groomsmen, a heavy-set guy in his 30s who'd been confident and loud all evening, suddenly found something very interesting to look at near the bar. I turned back to my wine. Not my situation, I thought. Whatever that is, not my situation. I was very deliberately looking at the peony arrangement in the center of my table, counting the blooms, which is something I apparently do when I'm trying to appear calm, when I heard the chair next to me pull back. I didn't look up immediately. I assumed it was one of the ski trip people returning from the dance floor. But the weight that settled into that chair was different. Quiet in a particular way. Controlled. And then I smelled it. Something clean and dark. Sandalwood, maybe. Understated in the way expensive things usually are. I looked up. He was already looking at me. Up close, his eyes were darker than I'd expected. Not cold exactly. More like still. The kind of still that takes either exceptional calm or exceptional discipline to maintain, and I genuinely could not tell which one I was looking at. "You've been sitting alone for a while," he said. His English was precise, barely accented, the words chosen carefully. I didn't answer right away. There was something about the directness of it that caught me off guard. Not rude, just completely uninterested in small talk as a preamble. "I'm fine," I said, which was the second time I'd said that to myself tonight, and the first time I'd said it out loud to anyone. And somehow it sounded less convincing externally. He didn't respond to that. He leaned back slightly in the chair, one arm resting on the table, and looked out toward the dance floor with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. One of his men had positioned himself maybe 15 feet away, near the wall, and was facing outward like he was watching the room and not the party. I looked between them, then back at him. "Are you—" I started, then stopped. "Are you here for the wedding?" Sounded absurd. He was clearly not here for the wedding. He was here for something I didn't understand, and probably didn't want to. "Taijin," he said, without me asking. "Evelyn," I said, without meaning to. He nodded, like he'd already known or like it didn't matter either way. The band started a new song, something slow, strings and piano, and across the ballroom, I watched Marcus pull Simone's cousin onto the floor, and I felt that familiar hollow pressure in the center of my chest that I'd been managing all evening with moderate success. I reached for my wine. My hand wasn't entirely steady. "The man in the gray vest," Taijin said quietly, and it took me a second to realize he was talking about Marcus. "He keeps looking over here." I froze. I had not noticed that. I had been very carefully not looking in that direction. "He's going to come over," Taijin added. Not a warning exactly, just information, delivered flatly. I set my glass down. The hollow feeling in my chest had sharpened into something more immediate, something closer to panic, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but just appears, all at once, behind the sternum. "I don't want him to," I said, and I hadn't meant to say it that honestly. For the first time, Taijin turned and looked at me directly. Not quickly, slowly, like a decision being made. "Then don't," he said. "It's not really that simple. It can be." He said it the way people say things they know to be true, without needing to explain the mechanism. Then he leaned in slightly. Just a few inches, just enough to change the geometry of the space between us, and said, low and even, close enough that nobody else at the table could hear, "Pretend I'm your husband tonight." The room kept moving around us. The band played, glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loud near the champagne tower. I sat very still. "You don't know me," I said. "No," he agreed. I exhaled. "That doesn't make any sense." He didn't argue with that. He just waited, with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of pressure, and who was entirely comfortable using it. I looked at the dance floor. Marcus had stopped dancing. He was scanning the room. I looked back at Taijin. His expression hadn't changed at all. He was watching me the way you watch something you've already decided about, waiting for the other party to catch up. "Okay," I said. And I don't know exactly why I said it, whether it was the wine or the panic or the 40 minutes alone at table 14, or something else entirely that I wasn't ready to examine yet. But I said it, and the word sat between us like something signed. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something quieter than that. And across the ballroom, I watched one of his men step directly into Marcus's path, unhurried, perfectly natural, the way a door closes. The thing about agreeing to something you don't fully understand is that the weight of it doesn't arrive all at once. It settles in pieces. First, I noticed the way the other people at table 14 had gone quiet. Not conspicuously, they were still talking. The ski trip conversation had somehow evolved into something about a restaurant in Aspen. But there was a self-consciousness to it now, a subtle awareness of who was sitting 2 chairs away that hadn't existed before. The woman directly across from me, blonde, mid-30s, had glanced at Tajan exactly 3 times in the past 2 minutes and was working very hard to look like she hadn't. I understood the impulse. Tajan himself seemed completely unbothered by any of it. He'd accepted a glass of water from a waiter who appeared at his elbow so quickly it suggested the staff had been quietly briefed on something I wasn't aware of. He didn't look around the room constantly the way powerful people sometimes do, performing their own importance. He just existed in the space, and the space rearranged itself accordingly. "You're not eating," he said. I looked down at my plate. The salmon had arrived at some point during the cocktail hour, and I'd moved it around enough to simulate engagement but hadn't actually touched it. "I'm not hungry," I said. He looked at the plate for a moment, then back at the room. He didn't push it. But maybe 30 seconds later, the same waiter who'd brought his water materialized beside me, and without a word, replaced my untouched plate with a small dish of something. Bread, a little cheese, some fruit arranged without fuss. I stared at it. "I didn't ask for that," I said quietly. "I know," Taijin said. I didn't know what to do with that, so I picked up a piece of bread and ate it, which was apparently what my body had wanted all along because the tightness in my stomach loosened almost immediately. I hadn't eaten since the granola bar I'd had in my car before pulling into the hotel parking garage, too nervous to stop anywhere, telling myself I'd eat at the reception. "Thank you," I said, because it seemed wrong not to. He nodded, barely. Eyes still on the middle distance. Across the ballroom, I could see Marcus again now. He was back at his own table, the head table decorated with more peonies and candlelight, and he was leaning toward his new wife, Courtney, saying something close to her ear. She laughed. She had a good laugh, open and unself-conscious, and I recognized with a dull ache that I didn't actually dislike her. I'd met her once, briefly, 3 months ago at Simone's birthday dinner, before I understood what I was meeting. She hadn't known about me either, or at least I'd decided to believe that, because the alternative made everything harder. But Marcus kept glancing over. Even now, even with his wife right beside him, his eyes kept drifting to table 14. And every time they did, I felt a small electrical unpleasantness move through my chest. "He's still looking," I said, mostly to myself. "Yes," Taijin said. "Does that bother you?" I asked. It was a strange question, given that we'd met approximately 15 minutes ago, and the arrangement between us was entirely fictional. But I asked it anyway. He turned to look at me then. Slow, deliberate. "It bothers me that it bothers you," he said. The sentence landed somewhere I wasn't prepared for. I looked away first, toward the centerpiece, back to counting peonies. 7, 8. The one in the back was starting to open, and tried to decide what exactly he'd meant by that, and whether it mattered. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Yes." "Why are you over here? There has to be somewhere else you'd rather be." He considered that for a moment, genuinely, like it was worth actual consideration. "I saw you when I came in," he said finally. "You were the only person in this room sitting completely still. I waited for more. There wasn't any." "That's it?" I said. "That's enough," he said. I didn't entirely understand that answer, but something in the delivery of it, the absence of performance, the lack of any attempt to make it sound more romantic or more significant than he'd intended, made me believe it completely. The band shifted into something more upbeat, and the dance floor filled again, the whole room brightening by several degrees. A few people from my table drifted toward it. For a moment it was just Taijin and me, and 2 empty chairs and the peonies, and the space felt different without the buffer of other people, more immediate, more real. "How do you know the couple?" I asked, because I needed to understand something about the situation I was in. "I don't," he said. I looked at him. "Then why?" "Business," he said simply. "The father of the groom. We had a meeting scheduled for tonight that he moved to tomorrow. I came to confirm in person." The father of the groom was Richard Callahan, a real estate developer with holdings across Atlanta and Chicago. I'd met him twice at Marcus's family events and found him perfectly pleasant, a little too eager to talk about square footage and property values, the kind of man who filled every silence with numbers. I found myself wondering what kind of business a man like Taijin had with a man like Richard Callahan, and then I found myself deciding firmly not to think about that. "So you're leaving soon," I said. He looked at me with that same unhurried steadiness. "I haven't decided," he said. The way he said it made it sound like the decision had something to do with me, which was either true or a thing I was projecting onto him, because I'd had half a glass of wine and 1 piece of bread and 40 minutes of quiet humiliation, and my judgment was possibly not at its sharpest. One of his men, the one stationed near the wall, broad-shouldered, dark jacket, the kind of face that was professionally forgettable, moved slightly, a subtle repositioning I might not have noticed if I hadn't been paying attention. Taijin's gaze flicked toward him for less than a second, then back. Something passed between them that I didn't have the vocabulary to read. "Stay close to me," Taijin said quietly. I blinked. "What?" "There's someone in this room who arrived in the last 10 minutes that I didn't expect." He said it with the same tone someone might use to mention the weather. No alarm, no urgency, just flat information delivered with complete control. "It's not a problem, but stay close." My heart did something complicated. "Should I be worried?" I asked. He looked at me directly. "No." "You'd tell me if I should be." It wasn't quite a question. He seemed to recognize that. "Yes," he said. And there was something in that single syllable, something definite and unmovable, that I believed in a way I probably shouldn't have, given the circumstances. I reached for my wine again. He didn't stop me, but his eyes tracked the movement, and then tracked me, and I had the distinct and strange sensation of being looked at with a kind of attention I was not used to. Not intrusive, not possessive, not yet, anyway. More like the way you look at something you've decided matters, whether or not you've fully explained that decision to yourself. Simone appeared at the edge of my vision, weaving through tables in my direction, and my stomach tightened again. Different kind of tight. The apologetic kind. She'd seen me arrive, and we'd hugged briefly near the entrance, and she'd squeezed my hands and said, "I'm so glad you came, Ev. I wasn't sure you would," with her eyes saying the whole sentence she wasn't able to finish in a wedding venue hallway. She reached table 14 and stopped. Her gaze moved from me to Taijin, and back to me, and her expression went through 3 distinct phases in about 2 seconds. Surprise, confusion, recalibration. "Evelyn," she said carefully. "Simone." I smiled. It felt almost natural. "You look absolutely beautiful." She did. She was in a deep burgundy bridesmaid dress that suited her, gold earrings catching the chandelier light. She looked beautiful, and she also looked like she had questions. Her eyes moved to Taijin again, and I watched something shift in her posture. That same small, instinctive reorganization I'd seen happen with everyone else who got close to him. She didn't know who he was, Not specifically. But something in her read the room correctly anyway. "I didn't know you were bringing," she started. "Tajan," he said, and he said it directly to her, calm and courteous, with a slight incline of his head. Not a bow. Just an acknowledgement that carried the weight of someone who chose every gesture carefully. "Congratulations on your cousin's wedding." Simone blinked. "Thank you," she said, almost automatically. Then she looked at me, and her eyes were asking about 47 things at once. I kept my expression even. Steady. The kind of steady I'd been trying and failing to maintain all evening, and which somehow felt more achievable now, with him sitting next to me. I didn't examine why. "I'll find you later," I told her. "Save me a dance." She nodded, still processing, and drifted back toward the head table with one last glance over her shoulder that I felt rather than saw. I exhaled slowly. "You're good at that," Tajan said. "At what?" "Keeping your face calm when you're not." I turned to look at him. He wasn't looking at me anymore. His gaze had moved back to that particular zone of the room he'd been monitoring, measured and quiet. "So are you," I said. The corner of his mouth moved again. That same not-quite smile. Outside the ballroom's tall windows, Chicago's skyline held itself against the dark, all-lit edges and distant movement. Inside, the wedding kept going. Toasts, laughter, the clink of glass on glass. And Tajan sat beside me like he'd always been there, like table 14 had always been his, like the empty chair had been waiting specifically for him. I ate the cheese. I drank the wine. I stayed close, the way he'd asked me to, and I did not think about why that felt, against all reasonable logic, like the safest I'd been all night. The toast started around 9. Marcus's best man went first. A guy named Derek, who'd clearly rehearsed the speech in front of a mirror several times and still managed to fumble the landing. And then Courtney's sister, who cried exactly the right amount and made half the room cry with her. I watched it all from table 14 with my hands folded in my lap, and I was fine. I genuinely was. The hollow feeling in my chest had settled into something more manageable, less acute, like a bruise in the phase where it stops throbbing and just aches when you press it. I was aware, the entire time, of Tajan beside me. Not intrusively. He wasn't touching me, wasn't performing anything for the room. He'd been on his phone twice. Brief, silent exchanges, the screen angled away, his expression giving nothing. And each time he'd put it away without explanation and returned to whatever version of stillness he occupied when he wasn't doing anything else. But his presence beside me was constant in a way I felt in my peripheral vision, in the warmth of someone sitting close, in the fact that nobody had approached me awkwardly or given me the particular kind of pitying look I'd been dreading all evening. His man near the wall had been joined by a second one now. I hadn't seen him arrive. He was just there suddenly, positioned at the other side of the room, and the two of them created a kind of invisible geometry around the table that I was fairly certain nobody else consciously registered, but everybody unconsciously respected. The toast ended. The cake was cut. The band came back with something louder and the floor filled again. "Dance with me," Tajan said. I turned to look at him. He was already standing, one hand extended, and I noticed two things simultaneously. That his hands were large, and that the tattoos I'd seen at his collar extended further down than I'd realized, disappearing under his sleeve. "I'm not really," I started. "Evelyn. Just my name. Nothing attached to it." But the way he said it made the sentence I'd been building feel unnecessary. I took his hand. He led me to the edge of the dance floor, not the center, not where the light was brightest and the crowd thickest, but a spot near the side where the chandeliers cast something softer, and the distance from the band made conversation possible. Deliberate. Everything he did was deliberate. I was starting to understand that, every position and every choice made with a specific outcome in mind. He placed one hand at my waist. I put mine on his shoulder. We started to move, and he was a controlled dancer. Not showy, nothing wasted, just clean and steady, and impossible to step wrong beside, because he made the direction clear before you had to guess it. "You've done this before," I said. "Danced?" "Used situations," I said. "Made yourself useful in a way that's hard to refuse." He looked at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not offense. More like reassessment, the way you look at something when it turns out to be more precise than you expected. "Yes," he said. He didn't apologize for it. I appreciated that more than I probably should have. "Is this useful for you?" I asked. "Being here. With me." "It's visible," he said. "Being seen with someone changes how a room reads you. More approachable. Less like a problem," he corrected mildly. I considered that while we moved. Around us, other couples occupied their own small worlds. Marcus and Courtney were dancing again, closer to the center, and I tracked them for just a moment before deliberately redirecting my attention to the middle button of Tajin's shirt. "So I'm useful to you too," I said. "You're not a tool," he said. Flat, immediate, like the idea required correction. I sat down because I wanted to. The rest is circumstance. I looked up at him. "That distinction matters to you." "Yes." "Why?" He held my gaze for a moment without answering, and I had the strange sensation of being considered, not evaluated, not weighed for usefulness or category, just actually considered, like a person whose answer to a question mattered. "Because you've spent tonight being treated like you don't matter," he said quietly. "I'm not interested in adding to that." The music moved through a bridge, something with more strings, and I felt the words land in a way I hadn't braced for. Not dramatically. There was no dramatic response available to me in the middle of a dance floor, which was probably for the best. Just a quiet internal shift, something rearranging. "You noticed a lot," I said, for someone who just arrived. "I notice most things," he said. It wasn't a boast. Just a fact about himself, stated without decoration. We danced through another chorus. I became aware, gradually, of a change in my own body. The tension I'd carried in my shoulders since arriving, that particular brace of someone waiting for something unpleasant to happen, had loosened somewhat. Not completely, but enough that breathing felt easier, that the room felt less like a series of obstacles and more like just a room. Then I felt it. A hand on my elbow, from behind, brief but deliberate. And I knew before I turned. Marcus. He was standing just off the dance floor, close enough that turning around brought us face to face, and he had that expression I recognized from 2 years of knowing him. The practiced neutrality that meant he was working out how to say something he'd already decided to say. "Evelyn," he said. "Hey, I just wanted to—" He stopped. His eyes had moved to Tajin, who had not stepped back, who had in fact shifted almost imperceptibly so that he was standing slightly in front of me and slightly to the side, not blocking Marcus exactly, just present, occupying the space with a completeness that made the space feel smaller. Marcus blinked. Something moved across his face that I recognized as the recalibration of a man who had come over expecting one conversation and found himself in a different one. "I didn't know you were bringing someone," Marcus said to me, but his eyes were on Tajin. "There are probably a lot of things you don't know," I said, and the evenness in my voice surprised me. I hadn't planned it. It was just there. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. "I just wanted to say hello. Make sure you were okay." "She's okay," Tajin said, not aggressively, not with any particular edge. just with the absolute, unambiguous certainty of someone answering a factual question about something within their direct knowledge. Marcus looked at him. There was a moment, maybe 3 seconds, where something passed between them that I couldn't fully decipher. A kind of reading that had nothing to do with words. And then Marcus looked away first, almost without realizing he'd done it. "It's good to see you, Evelyn," he said, and he sounded like he meant it, which somehow made it worse and better at the same time. He touched Courtney's arm as he turned back toward her, and they drifted away toward the far side of the dance floor, and I stood there for a moment just breathing. Taejin's hand had returned to my waist. I hadn't noticed when it happened. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," I said. And this time when I said it, it was almost true. We weren't dancing anymore, not really. Just standing at the edge of the floor while the music continued around us. And I became aware that one of his men had moved closer, the one from the wall, and was now hovering at a respectful but attentive distance, watching the room with that particular blankness that wasn't blankness at all, just discipline. "What happened earlier?" I said. "The person you didn't expect." Taejin's hand at my waist was steady. "It's handled. That's not an answer. It's the answer I have for you right now," he said. And something in the phrasing, "for you," the implication that there were other answers available to other people, made me understand, more clearly than before, exactly what kind of man was standing beside me. I should have felt afraid. I want to be honest about that. There was a part of me that understood, intellectually, that the careful positioning of those men, the way the room shifted around him, the unfinished sentence about something being handled, all pointed somewhere I had no map for, somewhere outside my ordinary life of graduate school applications and Saturday farmers markets and bad breakups at other people's weddings. But standing there with his hand at my waist and the amber light catching the ink at his collar, and the band playing something that asked nothing of me at all, I didn't feel afraid. I felt, oddly and specifically, watched over, which should have alarmed me more than the alternative. "I need some air," I said. "Okay," he said. And before I'd finished the word, he'd looked briefly at the man nearest us. Something communicated in a single glance, and by the time we'd crossed the ballroom toward the corridor that led to the outdoor terrace, there was already someone ahead of us, moving quietly through the door first, checking whatever needed checking in the way they apparently checked everything, before he got there. I stopped at the threshold and looked at him. "Does it ever bother you?" I asked. "Living like this?" He held the door open. The night air came through, cool and carrying the faint smell of the city, exhaust and rain and something green from the planters along the terrace railing. He thought about the question with what seemed like genuine attention, which I hadn't expected. "It's the only way I know how to live," he said finally. It wasn't an answer that invited pity. It was just true, delivered plainly, and it settled into me alongside everything else about him. The steadiness, the control, the careful deliberateness of every choice. And I stepped through the door into the cold air and heard him follow. And behind us, the ballroom kept going without us. Lights and music and a wedding that had nothing to do with either of us anymore. The Chicago skyline spread out beyond the terrace railing, enormous and indifferent, and genuinely beautiful. I leaned against the railing and tilted my head back, and let the cold touch my face. Beside me, Taejin stood and looked at the city with the same expression he'd used on everything else tonight. Quiet, assessing, revealing nothing. And I thought, I don't know anything about this man. Not really. Not a single safe thing. And then I thought, I'm going to stand here anyway. The terrace was mostly empty. One couple at the far end, wrapped in each other, paying no attention to anything beyond themselves. A hotel staff member in a white jacket who appeared briefly near the door, registered something about the situation without looking directly at it, and found a reason to be elsewhere. That was it. Just the cold, and the skyline, and the sound of the city doing what the city always does. Indifferent and constant. 17 floors below. I'd been outside maybe 5 minutes when I started actually feeling the temperature. My dress was not built for October in Chicago. It was built for the inside of a ballroom where the heating system ran warm, and the body heat of 200 people filled the remaining gaps. Out here it was 40-something degrees, and I hadn't brought a wrap because I'd packed for the version of this evening where I would be fine. I didn't say anything about it. I wasn't going to. Taejin took off his jacket. He did it the way he did everything. No announcement, no pause for acknowledgement, just a decision translated immediately into action. He draped it over my shoulders, and it was heavy in a way that surprised me, structured and warm from his body, and I pulled it closed at the front without thinking. "You didn't have to," I started. "I know," he said. I stopped arguing with that particular sentence. He kept using it, and it kept landing in a way that made further argument feel beside the point. His jacket smelled like that sandalwood thing, closer now, and something underneath it that was just him, I suppose, whatever that meant. I was aware of it in a way that felt disproportionate to the fact of a borrowed jacket, and I redirected my attention firmly to the skyline. "Tell me something," I said. "What kind of something?" "Anything. Something true." He was quiet for a moment. Below us a cab horn sounded, brief and sharp, swallowed quickly by the general noise. "I haven't been to a social event in almost 2 years," he said. "By choice." I looked at him. "Why tonight?" "Callahan's been avoiding a conversation I need him to have." He paused. "I thought appearing in person would make the point better than another phone call." "Did it?" "We'll find out tomorrow." He said it simply, with the particular patience of someone who'd learned that most things resolve themselves in the time frame they were going to resolve, regardless of how much pressure you applied, and who had made peace with that, without losing the capacity to apply pressure when necessary. "What do you actually do?" I asked. I knew this was the edge of something. I could feel the boundary there, not marked with any obvious sign, but present the way certain doors in certain buildings feel present. The weight of them. The density. He turned his head and looked at me with those dark, still eyes. "You know what I do," he said. And he was right. I did. Not specifically, not with any details I could have named or organized, but in the general shape of it. The men stationed at specific distances, the way Richard Callahan had paled slightly when he'd spotted Taejin across the ballroom, and then recovered and crossed the room to shake his hand with both of his, the conversation that had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 30 seconds I'd watched without meaning to, the handled situation I hadn't been given details about. "I know the outline," I said. "The outline is enough," he said. "Not threatening, just clear. Here is the boundary. Here is where the information stops." Not because he was hiding something shameful, but because this was the architecture of his life, and he'd built it with intention. I should have stepped back from it. Every sensible instinct I had pointed in that direction. Instead, I said, "Are you from Seoul?" Something moved in his expression. Not quite surprise. I didn't think he surprised easily. But something adjacent to it. A small adjustment. "Incheon," he said. "Originally." "How long in the States?" 12 years. "You were young." 20, he said, "which feels young now." There was something in that, "which feels young now," that opened a small window into something I hadn't expected. A before. A version of him that had existed before whatever he'd become, that he still carried with him the way you carry accents and habits from places you left a long time ago. "Do you miss it?" I asked. He thought about it. Actually thought about it, which I appreciated. "Parts," he said. "The food. The way the city sounds at 4 in the morning." He paused. "My grandmother's apartment. the way the light came through the kitchen window in the winter. I held very still. It felt like watching something rare happen, like the moment before a bird lands, when you stop breathing because any movement will end it. "She passed away," he said. Not a question. "I'm sorry," I said. He nodded, just once. Then he looked back at the city. The couple at the far end of the terrace had gone inside. We were alone. "What about you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question, more like an opening. "What about me?" "You're here alone. The man inside was someone I was with for 2 years," I said. It was easier to say out loud than I'd expected. Maybe because I'd been carrying it at full weight all evening, and I was tired. "I found out 3 months ago that he'd been seeing Courtney for most of the last year. He's marrying her." I paused. "I'm at the wedding because Simone is my friend, and because I thought I could handle it." "Can you?" I considered the honest answer. "Better than I thought," I said. "Worse than I told myself I would." He was quiet for a moment. Then, he looked at you 11 times during the toasts. I closed my eyes briefly. "I know." "Not with guilt," Tejan said. "With—" He stopped, chose the word carefully. "Confusion. Like he doesn't understand how he's in the position he's in." "He never did understand that," I said. "He always thought the situation was just something that happened to him. Like he was a passive participant in his own choices." Tejan made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to it. "Men like that are everywhere." "Do you know many of them?" "Too many," he said. "They're useful sometimes, but I don't respect them." The cold had settled deeper, and I pulled his jacket tighter. My fingers found the edge of the lapel without deciding to, and I held it there. "I should probably go back in," I said. I didn't move. "Probably," he agreed. He didn't move either. The door behind us opened and one of his men, the broader one, the one from the wall, leaned out and said something in Korean, quiet and brief. Tejan responded without turning around. 2 sentences. The man disappeared back inside. "I need to go in," Tejan said. "Callahan is ready to talk tonight after all." I nodded, already reaching to take the jacket off. "Keep it," he said. "I can't keep your—" "For tonight," he said. His eyes met mine, and there was something in them that was different from the steadiness I'd been reading all evening. Something fractionally less controlled, fractionally more direct. "Come back inside when you're ready. I'll find you." "I'll find you," said like a fact about the future, like something already decided. I stood at the railing with his jacket on my shoulders and watched him cross the terrace and go through the door. And through the glass I could see his men fall into position around him naturally, effortlessly, like water finding its level. And across the ballroom, Richard Callahan was already moving toward him with the particular urgency of a man who'd rescheduled something he couldn't afford to keep rescheduling. I turned back to the city. My heart was doing something I didn't have an immediate name for. Not the sharp anxiety of earlier. Not the hollow grief I'd carried in with me. Something else. Something I'd need more time and probably more sobriety to correctly identify. I thought about his grandmother's kitchen window. The winter light through it. The way he'd said parts when I'd asked if he missed home. Like the word was a door opened only partially. Enough to let air through, but not enough for full entry. I thought about the jacket on my shoulders and the way he'd said, "I'll find you," like it was already done. I stayed outside for another 10 minutes. The cold was clarifying in the way cold sometimes is. It doesn't solve anything, but it strips away the noise and leaves you with the actual shape of things. The actual shape of things was this. I had come to this wedding dreading every minute of it. And somewhere between table 14 and the edge of this terrace, the evening had become something I didn't have a category for yet. When I finally went back inside, the warmth of the ballroom hit me all at once. and I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. Across the room, before I'd even fully located him, I felt it. That same shift in attention I'd experienced when he walked in. That specific quality of being seen by someone who notices most things. I found his eyes. He was in the middle of a conversation with Callahan and two other men I didn't recognize. His posture closed and deliberate the way it was when he was working, rather than just existing. But his gaze had come to me the moment I stepped through the door. He didn't smile. He didn't gesture. He just looked at me for exactly 2 seconds, then returned his attention to Callahan. It was enough. I walked back to table 14, sat down, and poured myself a glass of water. My hands were steady. Outside the windows, Chicago glittered against the dark, and the wedding moved around me, and I held the lapels of a jacket that wasn't mine, and thought about a man I didn't know, and the particular, dangerous feeling of being watched over by someone whose world I had absolutely no business standing inside. I thought about it, and I didn't get up and leave. The wedding wound down the way weddings do, not all at once, but in stages, like a tide going out. The older guests left first, quiet exits with coats and goodbyes near the door. Then the ones with babysitters. Then the ones with early flights. The band played its last set with the particular energy of musicians who know they're almost done, and the dance floor thinned until it was just the people who weren't ready to let the night end, swaying to something slow and private. I was still at table 14. I'd moved through the last hour in a kind of suspended state. Not unhappy, not anxious, just quietly present in a way I hadn't managed all evening. Simone had found me twice more. The second time she'd sat down properly, heels off, feet tucked under her in the chair, and we'd talked for almost 20 minutes about nothing consequential. Her job, my sister's new apartment in Portland, a movie we'd both seen and disagreed about. And it felt like exhaling after holding your breath for a very long time. She hadn't asked about Taijin directly, but as she was leaving, she'd squeezed my hand and said, "You seem different than when you came in, and I hadn't known what to say to that, so I just squeezed back." Marcus and Courtney had left around 10:30. I watched them go from across the room, his hand at the small of her back, her dress catching the light, the whole beautiful, uncomplicated tableau of two people beginning something. I waited for the ache to arrive, and it did, but it was smaller than I'd expected. Honest and finite and mine. Not the sprawling, shapeless thing it had been for 3 months. Some griefs, I think, need a specific night to become the right size. I hadn't known that before tonight. Taijin's conversation with Callahan had lasted maybe 40 minutes. I'd watched it from a distance without meaning to. The way Taijin stood, weight evenly distributed. The slight forward inclination when he wanted to make a point that wasn't a lean so much as a deliberate closing of space. The way Callahan nodded in the particular rhythm of a man who was agreeing with things he'd intended to push back on. Whatever they were resolving, it was being resolved on Taijin's terms. Afterward, he'd returned to table 14. He didn't explain what had been discussed, and I didn't ask. He sat down, accepted another glass of water, and said, "How are you doing?" And the way he asked it was different from how people usually asked. No uplift at the end, no performance of concern, just a direct inquiry about an actual state of being. "Okay," I said. "Really okay, I think." He looked at me for a moment. "Good," he said. We'd sat together through the rest of the evening in a way that was surprisingly easy, which surprised me most of all. He wasn't a man who filled silence. He seemed to understand silence as its own form of communication, and so the quiet between us wasn't empty. It was just quiet, and I sat in it without feeling the need to cover it with words. At one point, his phone had vibrated, and he'd looked at the screen, and something moved across his face, barely. A tightening around the eyes. Quickly controlled, and he'd typed a response and put the phone away and looked at me and said nothing. But one of his men had peeled away from the wall and left the ballroom, and 10 minutes later the second one had followed, and after that, it was just Taijin. I noticed. I didn't ask. Now it was close to midnight, and the ballroom staff were beginning the quiet work of ending the night, clearing glasses, folding napkins, lowering the lights by degrees. The band played its actual last song, and I recognized it the way you recognize things you weren't expecting to recognize, something in the chord progression. And I sat with that for a moment. "I'm going to go up soon," I said. "I have a room." "I know," he said. I looked at him. "You mentioned it earlier," he said. "You said you'd booked a room." I had. I'd forgotten I'd said it. "Right," I said. Neither of us moved for another moment. "Your jacket," I said, and started to pull it from my shoulders. "Keep it tonight," he said. "I'll have someone collect it tomorrow." "You don't have to, Evelyn. Just my name," that same quality of making unnecessary the sentence it interrupted. I stopped, held the jacket closed, looked at him. There was something happening in the space between us that I didn't have clean language for. Not romantic. Exactly. Or not only that. Something more like recognition. The specific strangeness of two people who have no logical reason to understand each other, and do anyway, at least in this one evening, at least in these particular hours that existed outside of both their normal lives. "Can I ask you something honestly?" I said. "Yes." "Tonight, what was this for you, actually?" He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. The last of the dancers had left the floor. The band was packing up. A waiter moved through with a tray, collecting the final glasses. "Unexpected," he said finally. "That's not—" "I know it's not a full answer," he said. He looked at me with those still, dark eyes, and there was something in them that was less guarded than it had been at the beginning of the evening. Some small adjustment in the architecture, the way a door stands slightly more open than it did an hour ago. "I came here to handle something. I handled it. That part went the way those things go." A pause. "The rest of it, you, went differently than I expected anything to go tonight." I absorbed that. "I'm a stranger," I said. "You were," he said. Simple, past tense, deliberate. I felt that land somewhere in my chest, quiet and specific. The lights came down another degree. The last few guests were gathering coats near the entrance. Simone passed by at a distance, caught my eye, pressed both hands to her heart once with a small smile, and kept moving. I watched her go and felt a wave of something warm and uncomplicated. Gratitude, I think, for her specifically. For the friendship that had survived things friendships shouldn't have to survive. I stood up. Tai Jin stood too, immediately, and the simultaneity of it was something I noted and didn't know what to do with. We walked together toward the exit, through the almost empty ballroom, past the peony arrangements that were beginning to release that slightly overripe sweetness that flowers get at the end of long nights. My heels were loud, in the way heels get loud when a room has emptied enough for sound to travel. In the corridor outside the ballroom, the noise of the city became faintly audible again. The hotel hummed its late-night hum, elevator machinery, distant traffic, the HVAC system doing its invisible work. We stopped near the elevator bank. "Where are you staying?" I asked. "Not here," he said. He glanced toward the lobby, toward the entrance, the precise glance of a man orienting himself toward what comes next. "Car's waiting." I nodded. He looked at me for a moment. Not quickly. Not the way you look at someone you're about to leave. More like the way you look at something you want to have properly in your memory. "You're going to be all right," he said. Not a question. Not quite reassurance either. Something more like a statement of fact about the future, the same way he'd said I'll find you on the terrace, with that quality of things already decided. "I know," I said, and saying it to him, I believed it more than I had all night. He reached out and adjusted the jacket on my shoulders, just the lapel, just a small straightening, his fingers there for 2 seconds, and then gone. His eyes met mine, and there was something in them that I knew I'd be turning over for a long time. Something that didn't resolve cleanly. That wasn't meant to. Then he walked toward the lobby. 2 men appeared from somewhere near the entrance. His men, different ones, I didn't recognize them from earlier, and fell in around him naturally, the same effortless geometry as before, and the lobby doors opened and he walked through them and was gone. I stood by the elevator and held his jacket closed at my chest. The elevator arrived. I stepped in. The doors closed. In the mirror of the elevator, I looked at my own reflection. Green dress, borrowed jacket, eye makeup that had held up better than I'd expected. The face of a woman who had come to a wedding dreading every moment of it and was leaving something different than she'd arrived. I thought about what Simone had said. You seem different than when you came in. I hadn't known how to answer that then. Standing in the elevator, I thought, she was right. And the difference wasn't about him. Not entirely. It was something that had been waiting to be true since long before tonight. Some version of myself that had been folded away and needed a specific kind of pressure to unfold. The pressure of a hard evening faced alone, and then not alone, and then alone again in the right way. The floor number changed. 11, 12, 15. In my hand, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I looked at it for a long moment before I opened the message. The jacket was my grandmother's favorite color. She would have said it suited you. I read it twice. 3 times. The elevator reached my floor, and the doors opened, and I stepped out into the corridor, the soft hotel carpet silent under my heels. And I stood there in the quiet hallway reading those 2 sentences until I had them exactly. Until they were mine. I didn't reply. There was nothing I could say that would be equal to it. But I held the jacket closer as I walked to my room, and I understood, clearly, finally, without any of the noise of the evening around it, that some nights change the shape of you without asking permission, and the only honest thing you can do is let them. I unlocked my door. I went inside. The city glittered through the window, patient and vast, and I sat on the edge of the bed in a borrowed jacket the color of winter, and stayed very still inside the person I'd become by the end of this night, feeling the exact contours of her, making sure she was real. She was.